The leather folder landed on Stalin's mahogany desk with a sound that seemed to split the August afternoon in two. Inside, grainy photographs showed something that defied human comprehension. A city transformed into ash and shadow. 70,000 souls vanished in a single blinding flash. The supreme leader's fingers, yellowed from tobacco and age, traced the outline of what had once been Hiroshima, now reduced to a wasteland of twisted metal and vaporized dreams. His face remained stone, carved from Siberian granite, but behind those dark eyes, calculations raced like panicked rats. America had cracked open the atom itself and weaponized the very building blocks of existence. Molotov stood across the desk, watching his master's expression with the careful attention of a man who knew that misreading Stalin's mood could mean a bullet in some basement cell. The silence stretched between them like piano wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Outside, Moscow continued its victory celebrations, citizens dancing in squares, still believing the war's conclusion meant safety and peace. But here, in this inner sanctum of Soviet power, the real war was just beginning to reveal itself. The Americans had demonstrated godlike power, while Soviet scientists were still scribbling theories on chalkboards and begging for resources. Stalin finally spoke, his Georgian accent thick as winter fog, rolling over the Caucasus Mountains. His words came slowly, each syllable weighted with implications that would reshape the next half-century. He demanded to know how far behind they truly were, how long until Soviet science could match this terrible achievement. The folder closed with deliberate calm, but everyone in that room understood the unspoken command resonating through the Kremlin's ancient walls. The Soviet Union would possess this weapon, regardless of cost, regardless of sacrifice, regardless of how many lives would be consumed in uranium mines and secret cities. The atomic age had arrived uninvited to Moscow, and with it came a fear that Stalin would never publicly acknowledge, but could never escape. America possessed the power to erase Soviet civilization with weapons that fell from the sky like judgment itself. That August afternoon marked the beginning of an obsession that would haunt Stalin until his final breath. A desperate race against an adversary whose nuclear shadow grew longer with each passing month. The mahogany doors of Stalin's private office closed with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing him away from the parade of yes-men and frightened ministers who populated the Kremlin's endless corridors. Here, stripped of audience and pretense, the mask could slip just slightly, though even alone Stalin trusted no weakness to manifest fully. He poured Georgian wine into a crystal glass, the deep red liquid catching lamplight like arterial blood, and allowed himself a single moment to feel the weight pressing against his chest. The Americans had split the atom, while Soviet physicists still struggled with basic theoretical frameworks, a gap measured not in months, but potentially years, perhaps decades. That distance represented vulnerability. And vulnerability was a luxury the revolution could not afford. His hand reached for the telephone, that black instrument of absolute power, connecting him to every corner of his vast empire. 3 rings, no more, before Lavrenti Beria's oily voice answered with the practiced deference of a man who understood survival. Stalin's instructions came without preamble, without the cushioning diplomacy he performed for foreign dignitaries or even Politburo members. Every scientist, every engineer with knowledge of atomic physics would be mobilized immediately, pulled from universities and research institutes like soldiers, conscripted for an invisible war. Resources would flow toward this single objective as rivers redirect toward the sea. And anyone who questioned the wisdom of such concentration would find themselves explaining their doubts to Beria's interrogators in the Lubyanka's soundproofed chambers. Beria's promises dripped through the receiver like honey, laced with arsenic, assurances that the motherland would possess atomic weapons within 5 years, perhaps sooner, with proper motivation applied to the scientific community. Stalin listened with the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock, knowing that Beria's enthusiasm often exceeded his competence, but finding no better instrument for this particular task. The conversation ended without pleasantries, just a dial tone humming into the evening air like a flatlined heartbeat. Outside his windows, Moscow's spires caught the dying August light, golden domes and red stars proclaiming Soviet permanence to the indifferent sky. But permanence was an illusion shattered by those photographs from Hiroshima, and Stalin felt something he'd spent decades training himself to suppress, genuine fear wrapped in the bitter clothing of rage. America had leaped forward while he'd been managing armies and annexing territories, playing checkers while his adversary discovered chess existed on multiple dimensions simultaneously. The wine glass emptied in a single swallow, and Stalin permitted himself no further weakness. Tomorrow he would appear before the Politburo, wearing confidence like armor, dismissing American achievement as temporary advantage soon to be overcome. Tonight, however, the truth sat heavy in this locked room, where even the walls seemed to lean inward, whispering that the race had begun and the Soviets were already falling behind. September 1949 brought the thunderous validation Stalin had demanded. The successful detonation of RDS-1 transforming the Kazakh steppe into a miniature sun that registered on American seismographs halfway across the world. For 72 hours, Soviet radio broadcast triumphant announcements, while Stalin received congratulations from nervous Politburo members who understood that praise was expected regardless of personal comprehension. The achievement was real, undeniable, a plutonium core declaration that Soviet science could match American ingenuity when properly motivated by equal parts, patriotism and fear. Yet even as champagne flowed through Kremlin reception halls and medals accumulated on the chests of project scientists, intelligence reports arrived through separate channels, carrying information that curdled celebration into something resembling hollow victory. The Americans possessed not one bomb, not 10, but an arsenal, growing with industrial efficiency that Soviet production facilities could not remotely approximate, each new warhead widening a gap that single successful test had barely begun to narrow. The briefings came in leather folders stamped with classifications that made even senior officials hesitate before opening, reports compiled from spy networks, spanning Los Alamos to Washington bureaucratic offices, where production schedules lived in filing cabinets. Stalin absorbed the numbers with the focused intensity of a general studying battlefield maps, his fingers tracing columns that quantified American plutonium production, uranium enrichment capacity, and projected stockpile growth extending into the next decade. Where Soviet facilities struggled to produce enough fissile material for perhaps 2 or 3 devices annually, American factories operated with assembly line precision, churning out components for dozens of weapons each year. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving, a widening chasm measured in megatons and delivery systems in bombers that could reach Moscow, while Soviet aircraft barely possessed the range to threaten Western Europe. Each page turned revealed fresh humiliation disguised as intelligence assessment, clinical language describing strategic inferiority that no amount of propaganda could genuinely erase. Stalin summoned his atomic chiefs to meetings held in conference rooms where portraits of Lenin watched with revolutionary judgment, demanding explanations for why American capitalism somehow outproduced Soviet collectivism in this crucial arena. The scientists spoke carefully, choosing words like men navigating minefields, describing resource constraints and technological challenges, while avoiding any phrasing that might suggest systemic failure rather than temporary obstacles. They needed more uranium mines, additional reactors, expanded facilities for weapons assembly, each requirement representing investments that would strain an economy still rebuilding from wartime devastation. Stalin listened with predatory stillness. occasionally interjecting questions that revealed his understanding went deeper than the academics expected, his autodidactic intellect having absorbed enough physics to recognize evasion from genuine technical limitation. The meetings ended with promises extracted like confessions, commitments to double production schedules and triple workforce. Allocations, targets that everyone present knew verged on impossible, but none dared label as such. Winter arrived early that year, snow falling on Moscow with the weight of accumulated anxiety blanketing the capital in white that failed to cleanse the spreading realization of nuclear inadequacy. Stalin stood at windows overlooking Red Square, watching citizens move like insects beneath their winter coats, each one unknowingly vulnerable to American bombs that could arrive faster than air raid sirens might warn. The successful test had brought legitimacy and deterrence credibility, transforming the Soviet Union into the world's second nuclear power and theoretically establishing mutual risk. But theories dissolved when confronted with actual inventory counts, and Stalin understood with crystalline clarity that possession of atomic weapons meant nothing if your adversary possessed 50 while you struggled to construct your fifth. The gap wasn't closing. Despite every sacrifice, every resource redirected, every scientist working, until exhaustion blurred their vision, it was widening, and that widening represented an existential threat no propaganda could truly mask. The intelligence summary arrived on a February morning when frost patterns decorated the Kremlin windows like crystallized prophecies of doom, its pages bound in crimson covers that seemed appropriately blood-colored, given the contents within. Stalin read, standing, refusing the chair that aides had positioned, his eyes moving across columns of numbers that detailed American nuclear production with the precision of an accountant tallying debts that could never be repaid. The Americans now possessed hundreds of functional weapons, stockpiles, distributed across strategic air command bases, forming a steel ring around Soviet borders, each facility housing bombers fueled and ready for missions that could commence within hours of presidential authorization. Meanwhile, Soviet arsenals contained perhaps a dozen operational devices, weapons that represented monumental achievement but remained statistically insignificant against the overwhelming force America had assembled with industrial efficiency that mocked communist claims of production superiority. The breaking point manifested not as dramatic explosion, but as slow-spreading realization, poison entering the bloodstream gradually until suddenly the entire system recognized contamination. Stalin dismissed the analysts who had delivered the briefing, waiting until their footsteps faded down marble corridors before allowing his mask to crack, fingers crushing the cigarette he had been holding until tobacco spilled across maps of Soviet territory, marked with defensive positions that seemed pathetically inadequate. Every calculation led to the same conclusion. In any nuclear exchange, the motherland would cease to exist, while American cities might suffer damage but survive. An imbalance so profound it negated decades of conventional military buildup and transformed geopolitical chess into a game where the opponent held every meaningful piece. The thought burned like acid through Stalin's strategic consciousness. This man who had orchestrated purges and industrial transformations, now confronting a problem that neither brutality nor willpower could immediately solve. Beria entered without knocking, a privilege reserved for the secret police chief whose networks had provided the devastating intelligence. His expression carrying professional neutrality that barely concealed schadenfreude at witnessing Soviet vulnerability. They stood together, examining charts spread across Stalin's desk, colored lines tracking projected American production against Soviet capacity, trajectories diverging like roads leading to utterly different destinations. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Stalin spoke with voice like gravel scraping concrete, demanding to know whether espionage could acquire not just designs, but actual weapons. whether theft might accomplish what production facilities could not. Beria responded carefully, explaining that stealing blueprints differed fundamentally from smuggling. Assembled bombs, that American security around weapons storage made such operations virtually impossible, regardless of how many agents Moscow deployed. The meeting concluded as winter darkness claimed Moscow. Streetlights illuminating falling snow that buried everything in deceptive uniformity, making ruins and palaces equally white. Stalin remained alone with documents that quantified inadequacy in megatons and delivery systems. The weight of nuclear inferiority pressing down with force no leadership rhetoric could lift. America had won this round decisively, and acknowledging that reality, even privately, even silently, felt like swallowing poison that would take years to either cure or kill. The conference room, deep within the Kremlin's labyrinthine interior, had witnessed confessions extracted through fear and decisions that reshaped nations. But rarely had these walls absorbed the particular quality of silence that preceded Stalin's fury on this winter afternoon, when even the radiators seemed to hold their breath. Beria sat nearest the door, survival instincts positioning him closest to escape routes, while Kurchatov and 3 senior weapons scientists occupied chairs that suddenly felt like defendants' boxes in a trial where verdicts had been predetermined. Stalin paced before them like a caged predator, finally acknowledging the bars, his boots striking parquet floors with rhythmic percussion that measured mounting rage, each footfall another second of terrible anticipation. The American production figures lay projected on charts behind him, numerical evidence of failure rendered visible in graphs that climbed skyward, while Soviet lines crawled horizontally like wounded animals. Documents trembled slightly in Kurchatov's grip, the physicist's hands betraying nervousness that decades of laboratory composure could not completely suppress. Outside, Moscow continued its quotidian rhythms, citizens unaware that within this sealed chamber their leader confronted the mathematics of potential annihilation. The explosion came without warning, Stalin's fist crashing against mahogany with force that sent ashtrays jumping, his voice rising from controlled modulation into something raw and dangerous that made even Beria flinch, despite intimate familiarity with violence. He demanded explanations in language stripped of diplomatic cushioning, asking why Soviet science proved inferior, whether saboteurs had infiltrated programs, if the scientists before him lacked competence or perhaps loyalty required for this existential work. Kurchatov attempted response, speaking of uranium scarcity and infrastructure limitations, technical realities that required time and resources beyond what emergency directives could immediately conjure. Stalin interrupted with contempt that cut like January wind, declaring that America had built their arsenal in less time, that capitalist inefficiency somehow outproduced communist industrial might, paradoxes that suggested either systemic failure or deliberate undermining. The scientists exchanged glances carrying resignation, understanding that rational explanation would not satisfy fury rooted in geopolitical terror. Stalin's rage fed on impotence, this man accustomed to bending reality through willpower, now confronting physics and production capacity that remained indifferent to authority. Beria ventured intervention, suggesting expanded labor deployment and resource reallocation, proposals that translated into suffering for thousands, but offered illusions of progress. Stalin seized these offerings like drowning men grab debris, ordering immediate implementation regardless of cost, demanding uranium extraction triple within months. Production facilities operate continuously, every scientist mobilized towards singular purpose. His voice carried desperation, masked as determination, commands issued with characteristic brutality, but underpinned by fear that American bombers might already be receiving coordinates for Soviet cities. The meeting extended past darkness, arguments circling like wolves around the fundamental problem. Catching America required years, the geopolitical situation might not provide. When dismissal finally came, the scientists departed, carrying impossible quotas and certainty that failure would mean more than professional disgrace. Stalin remained alone with maps showing American bases encircling Soviet territory, each marked location a potential launch point for apocalypse, the strategic encirclement complete and suffocating. His anger cooled into something worse, calculated acknowledgement that Soviet survival now depended on bluffing with weak hands while frantically attempting to draw better cards. The nuclear imbalance had transformed global chess into Russian roulette, and Stalin recognized with bitter clarity that his nation held the gun with bullets while America controlled the trigger. The propaganda machine roared to life with choreographed precision, Pravda printing bold declarations of Soviet nuclear supremacy, while Stalin studied each headline from his dacha retreat, editing rhetoric that transformed American strength into capitalist bluster requiring socialist correction through carefully crafted lies. Photographs showed Soviet bombers he knew lacked sufficient range. Parades displayed missiles whose casings contained more ambition than actual warheads. Public pronouncements dismissed Western arsenals as exaggerated fantasies designed to intimidate workers' states into submission. He approved each deception with grim necessity, understanding that perception shaped reality in geopolitical theater, that projecting confidence might forestall American aggression, even as internal reports confirmed devastating vulnerability. The performance required absolute conviction, ministers instructed to speak of nuclear parity with unwavering certainty, diplomats trained to laugh dismissively when Western counterparts mentioned arsenal disparities. Stalin orchestrated this symphony of falsehood from behind scenes, conductor ensuring every instrument played assigned parts, while privately acknowledging the hollow sound beneath bombastic volume. Yet nights offered no audience for performances, darkness stripping away public masks to reveal the corroding fear that gnawed through Stalin's legendary composure like acid through steel, leaving him staring at bedroom ceilings while calculating flight times from American bases to Moscow's heart. Sleep became battlefield, where bombers materialized from clouds, mushroom clouds, bloomed over the Kremlin spires, scenarios his waking mind suppressed, but dreams rendered with terrifying specificity drawn from intelligence photographs he could not unsee. He imagined Truman receiving recommendations, military advisors suggesting preemptive strikes before Soviet capacity grew, conversations possibly occurring in Washington, rooms while he lay vulnerable in Georgian darkness. The psychological weight exceeded any burden carried during the German invasion, because Hitler's armies could be seen approaching, divisions counted and countered, whereas American nuclear threat existed in abstract potentiality made concrete only through imagination's cruelty. His physicians noticed deteriorating health he attributed to age, but recognized privately as manifestation of sustained anxiety. No amount of vodka or validation could adequately suppress the body keeping score, even when ideology demanded stoic indifference. Stalin found himself checking weather patterns obsessively, knowing clear skies favored bomber. Operations experienced irrational relief when Moscow fog descended thick enough to obscure targeting, temporary respites from exposure that strategic reality rendered meaningless. He demanded intelligence updates with increasing frequency, needing confirmation that American bombers remained grounded, that diplomatic channels showed no sudden crisis escalation, constantly seeking reassurance that apocalypse remained theoretical rather than imminent. The duality consumed him completely, public Stalin projecting invincible confidence, while private Stalin wrestled with terror that American patience might expire before Soviet science achieved genuine deterrence. Two selves occupying single body like matter and antimatter awaiting catastrophic collision. He had spent decades cultivating image as man who feared nothing, reshaping nations through will alone. Yet American atomic monopoly revealed limits even Stalin could not transcend through purges or propaganda. Mortality rendered national rather than personal, but equally inescapable, leaving him trapped between necessary deception and unbearable truth. The orders descended from the Kremlin like winter itself, bureaucratic language concealing human cost as efficiently as snow buries abandoned corpses, directives drafted in Beria's office, transforming citizens into resources to be extracted alongside uranium ore from the frozen earth. Entire villages in Kazakhstan received 48 hours notice before NKVD trucks arrived. Families herded from ancestral homes to make room for mining operations that demanded land without complications like prior inhabitants who might witness what happened there. Geiger counters clicked across remote territories where shepherds once grazed flocks. Geological surveys marking deposits that Stalin's desperation elevated to strategic priority, superseding any consideration beyond atomic parity with America. Labor camps swelled with new classifications of prisoners, petty criminals, and political suspects alike, reclassified as contributors to the nuclear program through involuntary service in mines, where safety protocols represented bourgeois luxury the motherland could not afford. The machine of Soviet industrialization, already accustomed to grinding individuals into statistical abstractions, discovered fresh purpose in Stalin's demand that production quotas double, regardless of methodology required to achieve numbers that might narrow the gap. The uranium mines operated beyond reach of international observers, carved into mountain ranges where winter lasted 8 months and summer offered merely different category of misery for those sentenced to extract radioactive ore with inadequate protection. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in tunnels where dust coated lungs with particles that would kill them years after release, assuming survival long enough for delayed consequences to manifest rather than immediate collapse from exhaustion or accidents. Guards rotated frequently to limit their exposure, while inmates remained until bodies failed, or production targets freed them through completion of arbitrary sentences extended whenever quotas demanded additional labor. Engineers from Moscow arrived with blueprints for processing facilities, ordering construction crews to work through blizzards that froze cement before it could properly set, structures rising with floors built into foundations that haste ensured but necessity refused to acknowledge. The human cost accumulated in ledgers never shown to Stalin, summary reports mentioning only tonnage extracted and deadlines met, translating suffering into metrics that justified methods through results. Resources flowed toward the nuclear program like blood redirected from limbs to preserve the heart. Factories retooled for uranium processing while consumer goods disappeared from shelves already perpetually bare. Collective farms requisitioned for additional quotas to feed workers whose radiation exposure demanded caloric intake their rations never provided. Trucks carried ore along roads, where convoys passed villages experiencing famine, strategic priority overriding humanitarian concern as Stalin's anxiety dictated allocation that starved periphery to strengthen center. Scientists received whatever equipment they requested, while hospitals made do with shortages. The hierarchy of survival revealing what mattered most to leadership confronting American nuclear superiority. Rail lines extended into wilderness previously considered too remote for development, tracks laid across permafrost by labor crews who understood their work carried urgency that personal welfare could not diminish. The desperation permeated every level of operation, from Politburo meetings where Beria reported progress in percentages that omitted casualties, to mine supervisors falsifying safety inspections. Because acknowledging dangers meant production delays Stalin would not tolerate. the entire system bent toward singular purpose, closing the nuclear gap through methods that demonstrated how far Soviet leadership would sacrifice present humanity for future survival. Stalin's fear of American bombs, justifying domestic brutality that paradoxically mirrored the devastation he desperately sought to prevent. The paradox never reached his consideration, terror of external annihilation eclipsing internal destruction, his orders guaranteed, Cold War logic reducing morality to binary calculation where anything accelerating atomic parity became permissible, regardless of cost, measured in lives rather than rubles. The realization settled over Stalin like ash from a distant fire. If numbers could not be matched, then the battlefield itself must be redesigned. Soviet strategy pivoting from impossible parity toward asymmetric advantages that transform nuclear inferiority into merely one factor among many in the lethal calculus of superpower. Confrontation. Maps spread across conference tables in the Kremlin showed Western Europe's vulnerability. American atomic superiority rendered less decisive if conventional Soviet forces could reach the Atlantic before Washington contemplated using weapons that might trigger Armageddon. Tank divisions multiplied along the Iron Curtain, mechanized units rehearsing scenarios where speed and mass compensated for what Soviet arsenals lacked in nuclear warheads. Stalin gambling that Americans would hesitate to incinerate cities over territorial disputes that conventional warfare might resolve. The strategic shift represented admission disguised as innovation, acknowledging the gap while refusing to concede the contest. Cold War logic discovering alternatives when direct competition proved unattainable through industrial capacity alone. Intelligence operations expanded with urgency that matched the nuclear program itself. Espionage networks penetrating Western laboratories where secrets might be stolen faster than Soviet. Scientists could independently develop them. Every blueprint smuggled from Los Alamos or British facilities, narrowing the technological divide that resources alone could not bridge. Beria's operatives recruited physicists and engineers whose ideological sympathies or personal vulnerabilities made them susceptible to approaches, information flowing eastward through channels that bypassed years of research. The motherland lacked time to duplicate. The spy networks became force multipliers in the atomic competition, Stalin recognizing that intelligence victories could achieve what production quotas struggled to deliver. Asymmetric warfare extended into laboratories and drawing rooms where persuasion accomplished what uranium mines could not. Propaganda machinery amplified every Soviet achievement while dismissing American advantages as desperate imperialism. Psychological warfare designed to convince both domestic and international audiences that nuclear stockpiles mattered less than revolutionary determination and socialist solidarity. Radio broadcasts proclaimed Soviet strength in conventional forces, suggesting that American bombs represented weakness rather than power. Nations requiring such weapons obviously lacking confidence in soldiers or ideology. The narrative constructed alternative scorecard for Cold War competition, redefining victory conditions to emphasize categories where Soviet capabilities exceeded American. Stalin's anxiety transmuted into aggressive posturing that masked fear beneath bravado. Military doctrine evolved to embrace what necessity demanded. Soviet generals developing tactics that assumed nuclear inferiority while identifying scenarios where that disadvantage became irrelevant. War plans written around speed and surprise that might achieve objectives before American bombers could mobilize responses. The adaptation revealed Stalin's strategic flexibility born from desperation. Unable to match the enemy in one dimension, he expanded the contest into others where Soviet advantages might compensate, transforming the arms race into multidimensional chess game, where nuclear weapons represented powerful but not omnipotent pieces on a board that included armies, spies, and psychological warfare competing simultaneously. The reports arrived in leather folders stamped with crimson seals, intelligence summaries that catalogued American bomber deployments. Warhead estimates climbing into figures that transformed strategic calculus into existential dread, each briefing session leaving Stalin more withdrawn than the one before. His physicians noted deteriorating health throughout the autumn months, blood pressure spiking during meetings, where generals presented contingency plans that assumed Soviet. Cities simply ceased existing in opening hours of any confrontation, war games concluding with outcomes too catastrophic for even hardened military minds to contemplate without visible discomfort. Sleep became irregular, the aging dictator pacing Kuntsevo residence corridors past midnight, his security detail hearing muttered calculations through closed doors, numbers representing megatons and delivery systems, rather than industrial production or agricultural yields that had consumed previous decades of obsessive planning. Trust evaporated like morning frost under harsh scrutiny, Stalin's paranoia finding fresh targets among the scientists and officials responsible for closing gaps that widened despite their efforts. His suspicions detecting sabotage and conspiracy in technical limitations that rational analysis attributed to industrial capacity and resource constraints. Beria received late-night summons where accusations surfaced without warning, the security chief defending programs and personnel against charges that shifted. Unpredictably, loyalty demonstrated yesterday providing no immunity from suspicion tomorrow, when new intelligence revealed American advantages persisting despite promises of progress. The Kremlin atmosphere grew suffocating, officials speaking in careful phrases that committed to nothing, every statement potentially becoming evidence in future. Interrogations, where context collapsed under ideological interpretation that recognized only success or betrayal as possible explanations for outcomes. Meetings stretched into marathon sessions where Stalin demanded explanations that satisfied emotional needs rather than technical realities, physicists attempting to convey limitations of uranium, enrichment processes, while their interrogator sought assurances that willpower and resources could overcome fundamental constraints of nuclear chemistry and engineering capacity. The disconnect between scientific possibility and political requirement created unbridgeable communication chasm, experts fearing that honest assessments might be interpreted as defeatism, while optimistic projections invited accusations of deception when timelines inevitably extended beyond initial estimates. The Soviet atomic program operated under conditions where truth became dangerous commodity. Information filtered through layers of anxiety before reaching the leader, whose questions allowed no acceptable answers. Winter deepened around Moscow as the year drew toward conclusion, snow accumulating against Kremlin walls, while inside those fortifications an aging revolutionary confronted mortality intertwined with national vulnerability, personal decline mirroring fears of Soviet weakness that no propaganda could entirely suppress. The nuclear imbalance haunted his final months like spectre, visible only to him. American capabilities, representing judgment he could neither prevent nor adequately answer. History's verdict approaching through mushroom clouds that existed only in intelligence estimates but felt more real than the snow falling silently outside his windows. The stroke came during early March darkness, Stalin collapsing in his Kuntsevo dacha study where intelligence reports still lay scattered across the desk, American bomber ranges and warhead inventories becoming the last documents his failing eyes would process before consciousness slipped away into the void he'd spent months dreading. His guards found him. Hours later, the delay itself testament to the isolation he'd cultivated, surrounded by security apparatus, yet fundamentally alone with fears that couldn't be shared without admitting vulnerability no dictator could afford to display. The physicians arrived to attend a patient whose condition reflected more than mere biological failure. The physical collapse, manifesting psychological burdens that decades of absolute power had seemed to render impossible. Mortality, claiming the man who'd reshaped nations but couldn't reshape atomic physics to match American industrial capacity. Within the Kremlin's corridors, succession struggles commenced before the body cooled, yet competing. Factions inherited more than power. They assumed responsibility for strategic nightmare their predecessor had concealed behind propaganda walls that fooled populations but never fooled the leadership examining classified assessments. Malenkov and Khrushchev pored over briefing documents that quantified the nuclear gap in stark numerical terms. American stockpiles measured in hundreds, while Soviet arsenals remained in dozens. The imbalance representing existential threat that transcended ideological competition to become simple question of national survival. The new collective leadership faced choices Stalin had avoided through denial and displacement, whether to acknowledge inferiority and seek accommodation, or double down on programs that demanded resources already stretched beyond sustainable limits. Either path requiring courage, the late dictator had ultimately lacked. The atomic anxiety Stalin experienced in private now became institutional condition, his successors transforming personal paranoia into systematic policy that would define Soviet strategy for generations. The arms race evolving from desperate catch-up effort into permanent feature of superpower competition. Resources flowed toward nuclear programs with renewed urgency. Uranium mining operations expanding across Central Asian steppes, entire cities constructed around weapons facilities that consumed national wealth justified by calculations Stalin had obsessed over during final months. The fear he'd hidden behind closed doors became driving force of Soviet military doctrine, his legacy measured not in industrial achievements or territorial expansion, but in the perpetual chase for atomic parity that would consume successor regimes until the system itself collapsed under accumulated weight. History would remember Stalin for many crimes and transformations, but perhaps his most enduring influence resided in the nuclear terror he bequeathed to those who inherited his power, fear that outlived the man and shaped decades of global confrontation where annihilation remained always free. Decisions away from implementation, his private nightmare becoming the world's shared reality. Did Stalin's nuclear paranoia shape the Cold War more than any ideology or battle? Subscribe to explore the hidden fears that nearly ended civilization.